and that we're at one of those moments where America First actually is not in not just in Europe's national security interests, but not in our own national security interests.
The other event, which I think was really incredibly funny, was the Swiss turning up in the White House and giving Donald Trump a Rolex and a gold bar. It seems to me that looked exactly like a Swiss bride.
With Israel sort of emerging as a very dominant power in the region, that's going to reshape history for decades to come.
Welcome to One Decision. And our guests today are Sabrina Singh, who's the former Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary in the DOD and also served as a special assistant to President Biden and was Deputy Press Secretary to Kamala Harris. And Jim Sciutto, who is the Chief National Security Analyst and reporter for CNN, an anchor of The Brief, and has also reported from more than 50 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. Now, today we were going to talk about 2025 and your observations for what's been a pretty extraordinary year. I think it's a year of unprecedented disruption in international affairs. Gold price has never been higher, which is a good indicator of instability. AI is making us rethink employment, education, aspects of creativity. And the long shadow of the pandemic has upended various economies and certainly inhibited their growth. Ozempic is slaying the dragon of obesity, perhaps. And then we have Trump, Putin, Xi, and Netanyahu, and each in their own way, I think you can say, has taken a hammer to the fragile porcelain of international security. So let me ask you, Sabrina, first, how you would characterize 2025 and what your sort of general comments before we get into more specifics.
Yeah, no, you sort of encapsulated a lot, I think, of what I think about when I think about 2025. It's everything from tariffs to how much more present AI has become in our lives, and that's something that's not going away. And then sort of the unraveling of U.S. foreign policy that we've known it since, pretty much the Cold War, and the sort of this new isolationist doctrine that's come out of the Trump administration, really pulling the United States back from the world stage. And I think, this idea that sort of modeling it after the Monroe Doctrine of like these spheres of influence, I think that's really rattling not just people here in the United States, but all around the world. I think, countries, leaders look to the United States for steady leadership. And this year, we've certainly seen a reversal of traditional policies. We've seen sort of other countries potentially want to take the leadership role and on the global stage. And, you're thinking of China, and also, Russia is certainly reasserting its dominance. So I think you sort of encapsulated everything that we're thinking of. But it's also this just complete upending of American foreign policy. And, I think this administration is going to continue to push the limits of what U.S. foreign policy looks like on the global stage, and also how that impacts and fractures our alliances around the world.
Jim, turning to you, well, you and I share a strong interest and expertise in national security, but how do you see this sort of general scenario now in this extraordinary year?
Well, I'll begin by agreeing with Sabrina that I think the principal disruption is the American retreat from the somewhat uninspiringly named rules-based international order, post-World War II order, whatever you want to call it, that not only did a decent, though imperfect job of keeping the peace largely, at least among the great powers since World War II, but also served U.S. interests remarkably well, and not just national security interests, but also trade interests, economic interests well, keeping the peace in Europe, keeping sea lanes in Asia open. And it's an American retreat, unrequired, right? A voluntary retreat from a system that I'd argue served American interests pretty remarkably well. And if you or I were sitting in Beijing or Moscow a year ago, and hoping for an outcome that would serve our own interests, one thing that would be at the top of our list, and by the way, this is not secret, Russia and China have been rooting for the end of this system or the dissolution of it or the reordering of this system for years, decades, arguably. If you or I were sitting in Moscow or Beijing a year ago, this would be at the top of our wish list. And it's been granted voluntarily by the United States of America. And I've been speaking to diplomats and officials around the world over the last several weeks and months because I'm writing a book on this topic. And what strikes me is that what they say in private is remarkably different from what they say in public. It's much like talking to Republicans on Capitol Hill. In private, they will say, this is a major disruption. There's no turning back. We don't trust the U.S. anymore. We're on our own. While in public, they will say quite differently, well, we celebrate, many of the changes coming out of Washington, et cetera. But the private concerns are very real.
If it's about make America great again, okay, that's just a soundbite. I mean, the way you express it, Jim, we're going absolutely in the opposite direction. And it seems, counterintuitive because you can look at it in such a negative fashion. The only thing I would say, though, as a student of American history in my past, is that there have been periods in American foreign policy which are distinctly isolationist when looking at the rest of the world. And, you can put Trump into that isolationist context. And if you do, it doesn't seem quite as odd as it seems at the moment, okay, given Pax Americana and the state of the world since 1945. So, I try to say to people, why are you so surprised?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk about America first, it's not a surprise that these are some of the policies that this administration is enacting and pushing forward. Donald Trump came in and was elected by the American people on the idea that we are going to refocus on America. But I think what they're really missing is reprioritizing American interests or saying, the slogan, make America great again or America first. Abdicating our leadership on the world stage actually does not make us stronger. And it's actually not in the interest of American values, American national security, and American leadership. And so I think there's a bit of a dichotomy between what this administration promises and sort of these catchphrases that, are frankly, as we saw both in 2016 and 2024, these slogans that Donald Trump came in on are incredibly effective and they rally people around sort of this idea that, yes, America first. But when you pull the United States back from its real leadership, what you're going to have is countries like China, like Russia, like other actors around the world that are going to want to rise and fill the void. And that is going to be at a loss of American national security. So it's not America first when you really take us back and then also abandon all of our alliances.
And you're always smart if you're agreeing with Sabrina, right?
Well, thanks, Jim. I was going to say the same thing. I was agreeing with you on the last one.
Well, listen, I first of all, I agree that, when you look at the broad, not just the current slate of challenges to the U.S., particularly in a great power context, but even the sweep of history of the last 100 years, that that it is not in America's interest to retreat from the world entirely. And to your point, Richard, the U.S., of course, has gone through this pendulum swing, right, of interventionism and retreat or isolationism. But I'd argue that when America has gone through this pendulum swings, it is often overcorrected, right? And if you think of America first in the late 1930s, where the term came from, had Roosevelt not coaxed America into intervening in World War II, what would the world have looked like, right? What if the America Firsters had won in the 1940 election, et cetera? Would we be safer had we let Hitler march through Europe unchallenged? I'd argue no, and I think that we're in one of those moments here where while I'm not one to equate Hitler and Putin, they're different in many ways, but I would argue there are a lot of parallels between the challenge when you have a revanchist, expansionist European leader trying to redraw the borders of Europe by force, And if he is not challenged and he's allowed to win and he's allowed to see that, well, actually, if I send my tanks across the border, I can expand my empire, that parallel is real. And that we're at one of those moments where America first actually is not just in Europe's national security interests, but not in our own national security interests.
Looking at more specifically the events of 2025, I mean, I think the big event for me and the most surprising event was Israel's defeat of the axis of resistance and the sort of collapse of the Syrian regime, which obviously changes very significantly the tectonic plates in the Middle East. And, I would almost refer to Israel as the new Sparta, has been extraordinarily, successful in conflict without making a moral judgment on Gaza, because obviously the follow-ons across the region are so significant. What events would you pick up as being particularly potent and important looking at geopolitics for the coming 5 to 10 years?
To pull on the thread that you had started, I think the 12-day war changed the game and changed the regional dynamics in the Middle East. I think with the U.S. leading those strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, I mean, that did set Iran back. And Iran, we know, financially supports, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, IRGC-backed groups in Syria and Iraq. And so the fact that, Iran sort of what was this sort of, and I mean, remains a threat, but a very different sort of threat in the region, changed the dynamics for Israel. And I completely agree. I mean, what is happening in Gaza is separate and needs to be addressed. But like just from a geopolitical standpoint of Iran as the threat, I think that 12-day war did really change the balance of power within the Middle East. And now with Israel sort of emerging as a very small country, as a very dominant power in the region, that's going to reshape history for decades to come. But I think the consequences coming out of Gaza and and there will be people held accountable, but I think that's also something that really changed the dynamics in the region as well.
It's arguably to both your points, the reduction of Iranian power is enormous, and beyond the 12-day war, right? Because it's many more days and weeks. The war against Hezbollah and Lebanon, the at least for now, successful suppression of the Houthis, and their threats to shipping, etc. The reduction of Hamas at enormous human costs there, and then the collapse of the Assad regime. Wow. I mean, who would have predicted that all in that span of time? It's remarkable, and really principally Iranian power. The U.S. piece of that, it's interesting. In the wake of the U.S. strikes, J.D. Vance tried to draw from those circumstances. I think he called it even a Trump doctrine, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was saying, overwhelming U.S. force with no U.S. losses, et cetera. This is the Trump doctrine. And I was like, okay, find me another problem in the world you could solve that way, like in a minute, right? Because the circumstances were so particular. Israel had already removed all the air defenses, et cetera. It was a great target of opportunity. That it's difficult to apply that, to other places. Although you might argue they're trying to apply that to Venezuela right now, the overwhelming force, and just kind of hope the whole thing collapses. But it was a very particular kind of set of circumstances there if you're sort of looking for a Trump doctrine. I would say that on the willingness of President Trump to strike a nuclear power I would argue, sent a signal to say North Korea or elsewhere that, well, actually, he might strike. And again, North Korea has different circumstances because it already has nukes and means of delivery, but that there was a warning to some degree sent around the world. The other piece I would say that I think is a significant development this year, and it didn't start this year, but it's intensified, and this is a product of the American retreat from the post-World War II order, is the open discussion of the acquisition of nuclear weapons. by our allies. There's a quite public debate about this in Japan, in South Korea. You have Germany discussing an expansion of its cooperation agreement with France, and then you have others who, look at Saudi Arabia, who are considering this. This is a byproduct of the reduction of the American nuclear and national security umbrella, which is an unintended consequence, but I think a quite significant one, particularly when you think that Donald Trump, I believe sincerely, does look at the threat of nuclear war as awful. We're just seeing the beginning of that, and that will have, I think, I worry, enormous consequences going forward in terms of proliferation.
I think that's a really crucial point. And I mean, if you had to pick out a foreign policy decision, I mean, the one I would pick out, like you, Jim, is the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities. I, watched that problem escalate with no one really managing to do much about it from the time that I was still in office, and this is way back in 2004, and it's just been pushed down the road. And suddenly, I mean, my view is it hasn't entirely removed the problem, but it certainly cauterized it to an extent at the moment, and changed the dynamic internationally, as you say, on nuclear weapons. So, I mean, there are aspects of Trump's decision making which have, let's say, beneficial knock-on effects, or you could say negative, depending on how you look at the nuclear issue. And I think, I'd like you to pick out other decisions that may have been taken in the year, which either had good consequences or, let's say, rather unfortunate negative consequences.
Well, I think from the Biden administration leading up to the Trump administration, I think you're seeing, the dynamics of how we interact with Europe completely change. And that is going to have consequences, whether it's coming from our defense industrial base or how European partners, look to other nations to fill their security gaps. The Biden administration did believed that we had to continue to arm Ukraine in order to protect European security and American security. And I think one of the biggest missteps that this administration has made is really how we treat our European counterparts, particularly that NATO bloc, but then Ukraine itself. Looking back at that, first February meeting with Zelensky and how off the rails it went, some of that relationship has been reset, but I think the rolling out, and I mean that quite, literally, of the red carpet for Putin, I think was such a misstep of this administration in Alaska. I mean, just an absolute miscalculation of how Putin would play this game. And he is, a master manipulator. And Sir Richard, this is more of your area of expertise. This is someone that is incredibly smart, who knows how to manipulate his subjects and use that meeting to just continue to run down the clock. And Putin does have the time on his side. I mean, he continues to, send his forces into a meat grinder and doesn't really care about that. And, Ukraine has suffered from, whether it's, the United States turning off military intel sharing, to slowing weapons packages, to now, going through NATO, which I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. But I think, when you look at decisions, I think from the Biden administration, which had a very different decision calculus when it came to Ukraine, to this administration, I think to kind of where we started the conversation, Jim, you were saying this, like Russia's sitting back, Putin's sitting back, and this is like the perfect playing field for him.
Mhm.
So, that's sort of what I'm going to keep looking for, as certainly as we head into the new year as well.
I would say two major foreign policy decisions, and not to make it all about the U.S., but that emanate from Washington. One is, and these are both works in progress. One is the U.S. approach to attempting to end the Ukraine war, and this administration's leaning towards Russia. And that's not even my description. It's a description of many European leaders, even quite openly, right? in terms of being willing just to give up more territory, right, to get to the finish line here, and not realizing, it seems, the consequences of that, not just for Ukraine but for Europe going forward, the precedent set, etc. And again, this is a work in progress. We've already moved closer to the center from that original 29-point plan due to a lot of pressure from Europe and Ukraine, and I think internally in this administration, I think from the Marco Rubios of the world, etc. We don't know where we'll finish, right? And does Trump just at some point say, I'm bored with this war, I'm backing out, it's your problem? We'll see. But that again, still a work in progress, but the leaning towards an outcome favorable to Russia. And then the other one I would say is again a work in progress, but this enormous buildup of military power around Venezuela. I've heard different estimates from a quarter to a third of the entire U.S. Navy is now situated around there, without a clear explanation of what the administration intentions are. Is it? I mean, it's clearly not just drug interdiction, right? Oil's a big piece, and they really would love Maduro just to leave under pressure. How far are they willing to go? Are they really willing to? Well, seems like they're quite willing to drop bombs on Venezuela. Ground action. What is the end game here if he doesn't leave voluntarily? That has enormous consequences too, I think. And again, a work in progress. But man, we're in it.
I also wanted to cover some of the more bizarre moments of 2025.
There are so many to pick from.
I know.
Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
I mean, okay. The ones I was thinking about Signal Gate and Hegseth, and obviously as someone who's very familiar with security and security of communications, that was pretty extraordinary. Obviously, there's the whole business of Greenland, and I'm fascinated to see that he's appointed Jeff Landry, who's the governor of Louisiana. I looked up the statistics on the Louisiana Purchase in the 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase exactly the same size as Greenland, by the way. So it was the same amount of territory. It's almost exactly in square miles. It matches Greenland. So I don't think Trump is a historian. He probably didn't realize that appointing the governor of Louisiana had a certain resonance if you looked at the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, it's up to the inhabitants of Greenland.
Yeah.
It's not up to the Danes. I've got a feeling they might be offered a very large bribe because there aren't very many of them. And a lot of them live in very tough conditions, but they are also very fond of their own precise and rather extraordinary identity. And the other event, which I think was really incredibly funny, was the Swiss turning up in the White House and giving Donald Trump a Rolex and a gold bar, because under a previous administration, they might have been prosecuted by the DOJ for violations of FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I just wonder what other incidents spring to mind as bizarre and amusing.
Well, if I could, one thing I'll say is on the ones you cite, and this is what I worry about them. They are bizarre, but they're also indicative, right? If you look at Signalgate, for instance, here's an administration full of people who have attacked others for mishandling classified information through the years, going back to Hillary Clinton. But there are no consequences, right, for doing quite the same thing. And it's not the only instance, right? And that's an example of where there are just of a broader phenomenon. I think that there aren't consequences for breaking the rules, or the norms, or whatever, or the law. It seems at times. I mean, to the point about gold bars, we're in a period of quite open public corruption, right? Where, I mean, the president starts his own meme coin, and anybody in the world can buy that coin to drive up the price, which immediately enriches the president. Who's doing that? To what degree? We have Trump. This might go for your list, Richard, but suddenly a profitless social media company built entirely on a platform that is really just the president's social media plaything is now in the nuclear fusion business, right? It's why? What's the financial basis for that other than his position? And it's just part of a broader phenomenon that is really, I think, quite concerning. And final on the Greenland piece, talking about how we are antagonizing our own allies. It's notable that in Denmark's national security strategy. They now have identified the U.S. as a potential threat because of its pressure on taking Greenland. NATO ally, treaty ally. I always remind people the Danish are not a low-level ally. They sent forces to Afghanistan to die, right? They did hard duty on the front lines there and paid for it in blood. And, that's all forgotten if you want to make a big land deal, big, New York real estate deal writ large. Right?
I completely agree with Jim, and sort of the norms that most presidents operate under have just been completely ripped apart with this administration. I mean, the enrichment of the Trump family, doing business, in the Middle East, the meme coin, I think for sure as well. You don't have that separation anymore, and so Donald Trump is going to walk away from the presidency a very rich man, and so is his family. But I think that's not only bizarre, but where is the outcry from his own party about this? I mean, this is the party that in 2016 was waving the signs around of drain the swamp. I mean, this is the swamp. This is what we talk about here in DC, and so. To see no check, no one actually willing to stand up to Donald Trump. And I think partly is because they are scared. I mean, look at what happens when you do. You get you get death threats against you, your family gets harassed. So and even Democrats, it's really hard to stand up, especially when you don't have any lever of power in Congress. I mean, Pete Hegseth has been bizarre in and of itself of himself. I mean, he is like almost like a kind of a caricature of, like he's playing Secretary of Defense. And just because you're the declassification authority on something does not mean that when an operation is ongoing that you have the right or should have that right to declassify very sensitive operations that could have put our pilots' lives at risk, and no consequence from this administration. I think the final thing that I will say, which is not surprising, but it's just like kind of like really like we're doing this, is like Trump putting his name on everything. The Kennedy Center, the Institute of Peace, these new this new like naval fleet that he wants. And it's just kind of bizarre, a president to name a fleet after him still living. That doesn't happen. So, that's a
Yeah.
bizarre storyline that I didn't
Yeah.
I expected, but here we are.
Well, to your point, if we
Yeah.
thought the limit was putting Trump's name above
Right.
a memorial to a dead president, an assassinated president, which the Kennedy Center is. So, the spirit, it says it as much, the John F.
Yeah.
Kennedy Memorial Center for the
Yeah.
Performing Arts. And that was the history of it. And I've lived in D.C. for years, and you look at that building on the river and you think of it as a tribute to this president taken down in his prime, to put his name not just on it, but above it.
Right.
It's pretty indicative, right?
I mean, we are merciless here in the UK when it comes to political humor with our politicians, and we have a particularly unpopular government at the moment with a prime minister who is the endless butt of irony, of jokes. And similarly, our finance minister, Rachel Reeves, the chancellor, she's known by everybody as Rachel from accounts. Because, she was, let's say, imaginative with regard to her CV and her experience of first line economics. But it's amazing to me how Trump has sort of seems to have silenced a lot of American sort of humorous riposte. But who are the thorns in, let's say, in the side of the administration? Not necessarily the political thorns, but the media thorns that have a big following and really make people laugh.
I always think, oftentimes the humorous news can do a better job of covering some of those extreme examples, because some of it does require the darkest of comedy, right? And not just for our own psychological therapy to get through it all, but because it is it is black comedy, right? I mean, if you, for instance, to your point, if you leak classified information, just say, by leaking it, I've declassified it. I mean, it's like the most comical circular logic. It requires laughing just to identify how extreme it is, right? You need it. You need it. It's sure. Oh, I sold my laptop full of classified information to a Russian agent. That I declassified it. But, I mean,
Right.
there's literally no limit. There's no limit to how far you can go, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's but I will say it's interesting. Some of my very conservative friends will say this to me often. They say, if you listen to the he's not a comic, as you know, but if you listen to the Tucker Carlsons of the world and so on, as they begin to split with this administration on a number of things, including, say, military buildup around Venezuela, there's speaking of thorns, there's a thorn and thorns in Trump's side from inside not just the conservative
Yeah.
movement, but the MAGA movement.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of saw that on display with, kind of the foreign policy implications of this administration is whether it's Venezuela or what's happening in Gaza. I mean, the MAGA movement is sort of fractured on where the administration should be. And so I agree with Jim. That is like definitely a thorn in, Trump's side. I think just on the sort of lighter note of this, like, you have the late night shows that, of course, are trying to continue to stand up and hold Trump accountable. But, South Park has really had a
Yeah.
resurgence of viewing, not just here, I think, in the US, but like, they have done an incredible job of sort of holding this administration's feet to the fire through humor. And whether it's, it's Kristi Noem, it's Pete Hegseth, it's JD Vance or Donald Trump, they have been able to find humor in some of the very dark things that are happening. And I think humor does shed a light on, some of the biggest issues facing our country today. So I think South Park is definitely one.
So thank you to Sabrina Singh and Jim Sciutto for that fascinating discussion of the events of 2025. I'm your host, Sir Richard Dearlove. Stay tuned to my conversation where we look at the state of geopolitics and global threats with Andrew McCabe, former Deputy Director of the FBI, and General Joe Vattel, the retired commander of CENTCOM.